All right, why don't we get started? So, welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are located in the world. We have a very diverse participation today for our first session in the series called Making of Modern Georgia. Um, and we are very pleased to welcome you to today's event. My name is Salome Tsereteli Stevens. I'm the president of the Georgian Association in the USA. And this is, again, our first webinar in the series that is going to be going on for a few months into the 2026. And so welcome to today's session. Let's go to the next slide as to give you a little bit of a background about the organization as well as what to expect from the series and from our today's wonderful conversation. So the organization itself, the Georgian Association in the USA, was founded in 1932. It's the oldest diaspora organization of Georgians in the United States. It aims to preserve and strengthen the Georgian diaspora community within the United States, and it also inform the American public on Georgian history and culture as a part of our mission to strengthen the ties between the two countries. Often, we have people in different parts of the world learning about Georgia for the first time, getting plugged into what's happening in Georgia today, but there's often not enough information available about the context. Where does Georgia come from? How did it come to be the way it is today? And so today we are starting this series that brings together Georgian and non-Georgian researchers, academics, and practitioners to provide context for everyone about modern Georgia. As you know, the country spans millennia and complex historical and cultural waves, and so it's important to understand Georgia today from looking into the history, the development of the culture, and nation as such. So this series will actually combine webinars, which is what you're attending today, but there will also be in-person activities such as movie screenings. We have an upcoming visit to the Library of Congress and other social activities to attract a wide range of participants and attendees. So I invite you all to spread the word. This is our first session today, and the recording of the session will also be uploaded to our YouTube channel. But invite others, go to our website and sign up for the upcoming session as well. But without further ado, let me introduce our host of the session today. We have Professor Beka Kobachidze, who has received his PhD degree from Ivane Cavakhishvili State University in Tbilisi, Georgia in 2015. He's a professor and the co-chair of the master's program in modern history of Georgia at Ilia State University. Beka has also lectured at the Georgian Institute of Public Affairs, JIPA, the University of Georgia, and the Caucasus University. He has been a visiting scholar at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University, as well as the University of Oxford in 2018 and 19. His research interests lie in foreign policy of Democratic Republic of Georgia, which is what we're talking about today, and the historical intersection between Russia and the Western great powers in the Caucasus and the related contested regional history of the Caucasus in the 19th and 20th century. He's currently got an ongoing project called Paris 1919-1920, Independence of Georgia and the Political West, and he is, importantly, host at the new prolific history podcast called Actualuri Historia. And I welcome everyone to join that as well. So let me welcome Beka to be the host of today's conversation, and he will introduce our guest for today. And again, thank you everyone who has joined us. Please feel free to utilize the Q&A feature of the Zoom outfit here so we can have a very engaging conversation after the presentations. And over to you, Beka.
Salome Dedimalova, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure and honor to be a moderator at the inaugural panel of the Making Modern Georgia. Good luck to the Georgian Association, and I'm sure that we're going to have fascinating panels ahead. So as of today, our guest is Professor Stephen Jones, and we'll be speaking about the Democratic Republic of Georgia, about Stephen's forthcoming book, which will be published in April 2026. And just to set a context about the Democratic Republic of Georgia, this was actually forgotten history both by scholars and people for many decades after the Soviet Russian occupation in 1921. And it was Stephen who arrived first in Georgia in 1979 and took interest into the topic. And then he went to Louisville, where there was a residence of Georgian emigre government. And these people basically were forgotten, and they were even surprised why Stephen was there. And for decades, Stephen was looking for colleagues, to whom to consult, with whom to speak about the topic. Since in Soviet Georgia it was forbidden to speak about it, and in the Western scholarship the topic was absolutely absent. He decided to pioneer in this topic, so he worked for decades and decades on this research, and finally he produced his book, which will be published by Harvard University Press just in 5 months from now. It's a voluminous, massive magnum opus, I would say, which counts 160,000 words. And I know that should Stephen be allowed, he could have written double than this. And I have had the privilege to read the manuscript, and it's absolutely fascinating book. And I'm sure that both Georgian and non-Georgian readership will be thrilled with, and we all will learn a lot from this research. So what's important about this topic, the Democratic Republic of Georgia, this is first modern Georgian state. So we had various kingdoms, duchies, principalities, glorious golden age, and then foreign yoke, and lots of wars and bloody history. But the modern state with elected democracy, Georgia created in 1918. And this history is not only forgotten abroad, but in many ways also in Georgia. And I'm sure Stephen will speak about it. Just I'll give you a brief bio of Stephen. I'm sure that most of the attendees know him all well. But just a reminder, Professor Stephen Jones received his PhD from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and then he taught at Mount Holyoke College from 1989 to 2022, and he published many books and articles on Georgian history, including Socialism in Georgian Colors, The European Road to Social Democracy, 1883-1917, published by Harvard University Press in 2005. Then Georgia, A Political History Since Independence, published by Taurus in 2012. And more recently, he co-edited with Neil McFarlane, Georgia from Autocracy to Democracy, published by Toronto University Press in 2020. And Stephen he became foreign member of Georgian Academy of Sciences in 2011. He received honorary doctorate from Tbilisi State University in 2012, and the same honorary doctorate from Ilia State University in 2018. And Stephen was a founder and director of Georgian Studies program at Harvard University. And I'm very much honored that together with Stephen, I am a co-chair of a master's program in modern history of Georgia at Ilia State University. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Stephen. Stephen will speak around 20 minutes, and then between us, we'll have around 15 minutes discussion, and I'll turn it over to the audience for Q&A. Please come forward to ask your questions, and we'll do our best to respond to as many of them as possible. Stephen?
Becca, thank you very much for that introduction. Welcome everybody. Mogasalma Bit. I always enjoy talking about this topic, as Becca noted. This was a practically unknown period of Georgian history, not only in Georgia but in the West as well. There was very limited historiography about the Republic. So it's been a long journey. As Becca said, I first came to Georgia in 1978, and I could not get into the archives, but I could get into the National Public Library of Georgia, and I was studying the Georgian Social Democratic newspapers, legal newspapers, leading up to 1917, with the help of Georgian librarians who were taking a risk providing those newspapers for me. And, trying to find people who knew some history about the Republic. It was practically non-existent, in part because, of course, Georgia was part of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union had a massive machinery of censorship and it controlled the reading of history and the knowledge of history. So it was excluded, essentially. But I got a lot of help, and I'm very pleased that although I was working largely alone for 3 decades on this, that now I have colleagues like Becca and many others in Georgia who have really, over the last 10 years or so, created many works and books, and have explored the archives to underline how important the First Republic was to the history of Georgia. And as Becca said, when you look at Georgian history, we're talking about the making of modern Georgia. In this series, you could go back in history and think about many very important points. I mean, the reign of Queen Tamara, for example, who united Georgians and had a darbazi, or a consultative assembly, which was very important to her rule. We've had even events like Irakli II, the agreement with Russia, although it may not be seen entirely as positive in 1783, the Georgievsk Treaty. Nevertheless, it was a very important event that we have to assess when thinking about the making of modern Georgia. As Becca said, the First Republic was really the first secular state in Georgia. Before 1918, there had been independent kingdoms with kings and queens. And they had a Georgian identity, West Georgian, sometimes East Georgian. We could even go back into the 7th and 8th centuries, 7th and 8th centuries BC, to think about the existence of Colchis and Iberia. But this was different in 1918, because for the first time it involved citizens. It talked about rights. It established itself in the international community at that time. And it had democratic governance. So this was a really dramatic change, and it happened at a time, of course, of extraordinary geopolitical shifts and changes. This was after World War I. And it accompanied the breakup of empires, like the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So it was a period of great chaos. And in some sense, of course, Georgia benefited from that because with the breakdown of empire, Georgia finally had its chance to establish an independent state. I think probably the first slide here would be useful. So here we can see Georgia, the Democratic Republic of Georgia. It was part of Transcaucasia, as it was known then, or Zakavkazia. And its neighbors were Armenia, Azerbaijan. And one of the first problems for Georgia was to gain recognition internationally and also to establish good relations with its neighbors. And this was a very difficult task throughout the period of 1918 to 21. There was a war with Armenia, for example, over the county of Borcharlo, which was disputed territory between the two states. You can see from this map, if you look at the east of Georgia, there was Zaqatala district, which was in conflict territorially with Azerbaijan. To the right of the screen, you see Batumi, which at this time in 1920, when this map, which this map represents, it was occupied by the British, by the British Empire. So, you know, it's a very complicated map, and it's a reflection of the extraordinary demographic complexity of the region, intermixed Georgians, Armenians, Azerbaijanis, Russians, Ukrainians, Greeks, Kurds, which made establishing unity and statehood very difficult for Georgia. You know, what one might think that in some sense what we saw in 1918 to 1921 is similar in some sense in terms of the external environment that Georgia faces is what we see today, where again we're seeing extraordinary shifts, not necessarily because of changes within the states themselves, but because of the dramatic transformation of geopolitical situation and external forces. And of course, small states are always vulnerable in these situations. And Georgia is vulnerable today. Obviously, we know that 20% of its territory in Abkhazia, South Ossetia, occupied by a foreign power. So you know, it's the situation in 1918 and today have similarities. And what they underline is the vulnerability of small states and the growth yet again of imperial powers. And that's a difficult situation for small states to deal with. But you know, again, as you can see from this map, there was a considerable number of territorial disputes that were determined by competition over land resources and also raw materials. Georgia, for example, was the terminus of the transport of oil from Baku to Batumi by rail. And Batumi, the late 19th century, was shifting 3/4 of all oil production out of the Russian Empire. Lord Curzon, who was the foreign secretary in the United Kingdom during this period, described the Transcaucasian Railway, which carried that oil, as the most strategic railway in the Middle East. And so, you know, this was an important region. It was important for Georgians to secure their borders, but it was also very vulnerable to the games and machinations of imperial powers at this time. The important thing for Georgia, and Becker talks a lot about this in his own work, was the drive to get some international recognition for the independent Georgian state. And there were mixed results. But in January 1920, Georgia was de facto recognized by most European states. And on January 27th, 1921, it was recognized de jure, not by everyone, but by the Supreme Allied Council, which comprised the major powers in Western Europe at that time. Interestingly, the United States never recognized Georgia either de facto or de jure, and there's interesting explanations behind that maybe Becca can talk about. But this was the priority, and of course there was the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, and this is where the Georgian government sent some of its best representatives to represent Georgia and to try and attain that recognition. As I said, it came rather late in January of 1921. And within a month, unfortunately, the Red Army invaded. But this was the priority for Georgia. The other part that Georgia had to deal with was, of course, the question of national minorities, which has not changed. How was it going to achieve sovereignty in areas like South Ossetia, not called such at that time, and Abkhazia, which had their own ideas about self-determination and statehood. The question was, how could they be incorporated, and how could rights of autonomy or self-governance be granted to those national minorities? And this was a very serious problem that created considerable instability in Georgia during this period, and of course weakened Georgia internally. Much of the time of the People's Guard, which was one of the major military forces in Georgia at this time, was quelling revolts among national minority regions. So, this was a big problem that Georgia had to deal with, and of course it continues to be a problem. Okay, next slide, please. So here is just a slide just to give you some idea as to the role of international powers in Georgian independence at this time. When we think about states gaining independence, we understand it as a right, although not all states get independence. I mean, the Kurds would be a classic example. And in many cases, this independence depends on imperial powers and their own interests. This map that you see in front of you places Georgia right in the center of this imperial dialogue or multilogue over what was called the Eastern Question, how to control the Middle East and how to gain influence in the Middle East by Western powers. This was one question. The other was, what were they going to do with the Ottoman Empire, which had lost the war and had collapsed. That was another issue. And of course, finally, I mean, not finally, there were so many issues, was Russia. And Russia was undergoing a civil war at this time. What was the West going to do with Russia? What should the Western attitude be towards the Bolsheviks or to the White Army? So Georgia was right in the middle of this maelstrom. And from this map, you can see the British and the French, and as far back as 1916, actually as far back in the middle of the war, came to an agreement called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, in which they decided to divide up the Middle East. And you can see here the red is the British claims, and you've got France that is at least having major influence in Syria and so on. So this was a way of dividing up the Middle East, and you can see also, I think, if you look under Georgia, that Armenia has a great extent of territory that we wouldn't recognize today, of course, that linked to the Black Sea. And this was a concern of the United States in particular, and President Wilson, who felt some moral obligation to Armenians and was very keen on creating an independent Armenian state. In many ways, Armenians were the greatest victims of the 1914-18 and then the 1821 period. They gained statehood. They had great hopes that Western powers would grant them self-determination and protection. And that was something that you can see on this map, the Treaty of Sèvres in August 1920, where yes, okay, let's give Armenian independence and let's also give Georgia independence. That was recognized that Georgia should have independence. The question was who was going to supervise that period of transition for Georgia to secure statehood. And initially, before the war ended, the Germans had been involved in establishing and protecting Georgian independence. And then that mandate, it wasn't the actually official mandate, but that informal mandate was given to Great Britain, which occupied Georgia from the end of 1918 to July 1920. So as you can see, extraordinarily complex situation. Georgia was very much part of that. And this treaty never really came to fruition anyway. By the time this treaty was drawn up, everything else had changed. It was far too late. You had the rise of the Turkish national movement under Mustafa Kemal. So the idea of negotiating with the Ottomans about this was already gone. And of course, by this period, Russia was largely under the control of the Bolsheviks, which changed the situation completely. The Bolsheviks, of course, had territorial as well as ideological ambitions. And in April 1920, it already occupied Azerbaijan. So, it was, again, a very, very typical story of imperial powers trying to divide up the world, but finding they were too late, and actually none of them really had the willpower or the capacity to extend protections and controls for countries like Georgia, for small countries like Georgia. So that was the international situation. Next slide, Rolly. Yeah, so when we're thinking about the creation of the Georgian Republic, it's obviously it comes about in some sense accidentally, because it comes about as a result of the crash of the Russian Empire. So it was unexpected in many ways. And almost all Georgian political parties at this time, there was a Georgian Independence Committee that at the beginning of the war was promoting the idea of Georgian independence, but most Georgian political parties were ambivalent about this. Not only the Georgian Social Democrats, who eventually became the ruling party in Georgia, but even the opposition parties like the National Democrats or the Socialist Federalists were ambivalent because they feared they would lose Russian protection and they would be vulnerable to Muslim empires to the south, always the traditional enemy of Georgia historically. So, the geopolitical situation generates in many ways the conditions for Georgian independence. But then you, of course, have got the people. You can't avoid the fact that this was a period of tremendous mass movements and mobilization. And in many ways, when we look at the creation of the First Republic, it's a creation of Georgian citizens and others who lived on Georgian territory, mobilizing in mass numbers on the streets for self-governance and self-determination. But leaders are extremely important, and I've got 6 of them up here. This was the an electoral bulletin for the Constituent Assembly elections in February of 1919 in Georgia, and you've got 6 candidates here. These were prominent leaders of the Georgian Social Democratic Party. You've got Noi Jordania, you've got Carlo Chkheidze, Yevgeny Gegechkuri, Irakli Tsereteli, Noi Ramishvili, and Noi Khomeriki. Now, I don't think all these characters here were necessarily the central figures in the creation and the shaping of the Georgian Republic. In my book, I talk about a quintet. And in that quintet, and the reason I do that is because I'm trying to think about a group of founders, which I call the founding brothers, who were really the leaders in terms of strategic thinking about Georgia and about the creation of an internal social democratic state with a pluralism and democracy and so on. Noi Jordania, of course, known as Beladi, the great, the leader, if you like, was a primary figure who really, through his theoretical works and his activities, shaped the Social Democratic Republic. If you can't think of Cuba without Castro or Russia without Lenin, you cannot think of Georgia without Noi Jordania. In my case, I added Valiko Jureli, who was head of the People's Guard in Georgia, which was the most powerful military force in Georgia. He started off his political life as a Bolshevik, but was convinced to switch to the Georgian Social Democratic wing, which was primarily, was influenced, let's say, by the Mensheviks. And he became a very important figure in the establishment of the Republic and the protection of its security. I also added Akaki Chrenkeli, who was not here, who was for a time Georgia's foreign minister and was absolutely crucial in establishing networks and promoting recognition among European states. A very important figure in terms of Georgia's foreign relations. I didn't include Irakli Tsereteli and Carlo Chkheidze or Noi Khomeriki in my quintet. Irakli Tsereteli and Carlo Chkheidze are perhaps among the most famous figures of this period, but they spent most of their time in Europe as part of the Georgian delegation to the Paris Peace Conference, advocating for Georgia. So leaders are extremely important. And if I had time, I would talk about their ideological opinions and how that ideology impacted the creation of the Georgian state. They couldn't always promote their ideological views successfully, of course, because they were creating a state that really had such limited resources and limited capacity to build a state, an effective state. Although they did, I would argue, pretty successfully, despite the obstacles that they faced. Just one more point about this slide is that they created a social democratic state. And this is why I call my book The First Social Democracy, which, there was actually a Labour government in Australia that was elected in 1910, but it was not a social democratic state. The Georgian government, from, let's say, at least February 1919 elections, when the new government in Georgia consisted only of social democrats, was really the first fully social democratic government that was focused on creating a social democratic state. And that was extraordinary for this period. And they eventually created a constitution which reflected the values and the ideas of social democracy, along with the ideas, of course, of Georgian nationalism. Okay, next slide. This is a picture of the Georgian Constituent Assembly, which was in the government palace. It was previously the Viceroy's palace during the Tsarist period. And it was a remarkable assembly. It was like a parliament, but it also was writing a constitution. It was multi-party. It wasn't exclusively Georgian Social Democrats. It had socialist federalists, socialist revolutionaries, national democrats, and other splits from those parties, created factions. Um, it was just outstanding in terms of its its debating. It was not constrained in any way. To the left of that image, you can see a press box. There was constant reporting from multiple newspapers from multiple parties about what was going on in the assembly. They were quite effective legislatively. The implementation of legislation was more difficult, but it was really quite sophisticated and not surprising in many ways because most of the members of the Constituent Assembly, in many cases, were lawyers or doctors or engineers. Yes, it did have representatives from the people as well, ordinary citizens. But this was an assembly that was highly educated and very sophisticated in terms of its knowledge of parliamentary politics and constitution writing. So this was obviously very important, a central pillar in the creation of the social democratic state. Okay, next slide. Yeah, again, one of this is a motorcycle battalion. Well, I'm sure it's a battalion, but it's a motorcycle group. You can see here there was a motorcycle battalion that was part of the People's Guard. And again, the emphasis should be, we're talking about the creation of a democratic state, but very often democratic governance came into conflict with the demands of security, which meant protecting borders. Sometimes it meant suppressing revolts. It meant ensuring internal security, which meant closing down the Bolshevik organization, certainly, but other groups that threatened Georgian security, which might not generally be seen as a democratic procedure nowadays. But this was the conflict that Georgia faces. On the one hand, it wanted to be democratic. On the other hand, it needed to be secure, needed to defend its borders. And one of the greatest problems was creating citizens that Noé Jordania and others often talked about. This was a question of internal security and internal legitimacy for Georgia, that they needed to create citizens of the Georgian state, not only ethnic Georgians, but others too, who recognized that they belonged to a Georgian state and would be willing to protect it and believed in its legitimacy. And that is a much more difficult task in many ways. It's done through the educational system. It's done through newspapers and reporting. It's done through getting people to pay their taxes. The different elements to creating citizens. And it was a difficult task. And it really, unfortunately, Georgia didn't have much time to do it. Anyway, I think I should probably stop there. Final slide, Roy. So this is what, as Becca said, this is about 400 pages long. It could have been twice that length. And if you want to go into more depth about this period in Georgian history, then the book will be available in April 2026. And just finally, I want to thank everybody who contributed to this inaugural seminar. I forgot to mention that at the beginning. Salome, thank you. Rory and Philip and Robert have all been involved in this. So thank you all.
Stephen, thank you very much for your fascinating introduction. I was listening to you and having read the manuscript. I want you to speak more about democracy. And as you many times note, history is not an independent phenomenon cut off from the present. So we need history for the present and for future. So I want to quote here Alexandre Lomtatidze, who was a deputy speaker of the parliament, of the Constituent Assembly. He wrote a personal and intimate letter to his friend, comrade, chairman of the parliament, Carlo Chkheidze. So Carlo was in Paris. Lomtatidze was acting chairman of the parliament, and Lomtatidze was telling him what they did in 3 months after the elections. And according to Lomtatidze, they are sorry. So Social Democrats are sorry and unhappy that the opposition got few votes and fewer seats in the parliament, which makes, he said, and I'm quoting here, which makes our party members too relaxed. And he wished that in the second rounds, in the next rounds of the elections, the opposition to show the better results. On top of that, they gave the watchdog portfolio or state audit service, state controllers portfolio to the opposition in order to control the finances and corruption. As we all know, most of Georgian diplomats were oppositioners rather than social democrats. And this we had, and the only coalition government through the history of Georgia was in the First Democratic Republic. So this we have, as opposed to what we have today, the ruling party trying and willing to ban all major opposition parties. So how come? I mean, what was the reason of such a profound understanding of democracy in the First Republic, and what happens currently to Georgians?
That's a fascinating question, and I think we should remember that when these empires broke down, there was a second international in Europe, a socialist international in Europe, and most of the independent states that emerged out of the Russian Empire were generated in many ways by similar socialist movements as in Georgia, right? Even the Armenian Dashnak Sutun, which was overtly nationalist in terms of trying to create, a large, expansive territory for Armenia, it described itself as socialist. And the same goes for Ukraine and elsewhere. So, when we talk about socialism today, or we get it mixed up very often with communism, we think about dictatorships, we think about economic dominance of the state and so on. But socialism had many different ideas and varieties, and in Europe at that time, when the Georgian Social Democrats got most of their understanding of what socialism was about, Europe at that time was producing social democrats like the German Social Democratic Party, or in Austria and France, which were a mix of nationalism, liberalism, and socialism, not the sort of disciplined, hierarchical Soviet understanding of socialism. So I think we have to be fair to Georgian Social Democrats. At this time, socialism was extremely popular. It was considered a grassroots organization, and it supported the idea of self-determination and small states and democracy, right? Not every, of course, socialist government goes through with that and continues those ideas, but the Georgian Social Democrats definitely tried to do this. I think that Noy Jordana was extremely influential in this process. Committed to the idea of a democratic state, and committed to the idea that you couldn't have socialism without democracy. Regarding the opposition, I mean, again, it was at revolutionary times where large radical decisions were welcomed. And the idea of a transformation of Georgian society was welcomed by most Georgians at this time. But so Georgian Social Democrats dominated because of their appeal. They were going to provide decent working conditions. They were going to provide economic security, right? They were going to provide local government where ordinary people could control their own destiny, right? All these sorts of things that we really don't, we don't think of socialism in those terms much nowadays. But then it was the norm to think of it in that way. Um, and the opposition really was not popular. That was the problem. National Democrats really didn't have a program that appealed, because in part the idea behind National Democrats was to preserve land for the landowners and not to give it to the peasants. Whereas the Georgian Social Democrats, remember at this time Georgia was 90% peasant, was saying, we're going to give the land to to the peasantry, and they will own their own land, and they'll have control. This was extremely appealing. The Socialist Federalists and the Socialist Revolutionists had a shot, perhaps, at competing with the Georgian Social Democrats at that time, but they had not the sort of profound links and networks that Georgian Social Democrats had established over 20 or 30 years of activity in the Tsarist state. And that, I think, partly explains why the opposition was so weak.
Okay, Stephen, thank you. I would, since it's the discussion between us, I will also add from my side things, so partly answering to my own question. So the sharing of power in the Democratic Republic of Georgia, it was probably part of political culture, because this republic emerged on the ruins of the Russian Empire. Now, the Russian Empire never was a democratic state or rule of law state, or anything related to, in modern terms, good governance. However, it was a Western Empire, right? It had institutions, so maybe the laws were discriminatory, but in difference, in contrast with the Soviet courts, Tsarist courts were functional. And for example, Georgian courts, in Georgian courts, we had judges who came from the Russian courts, and they were independent from the government. And the political culture, Georgian politicians obtained in Russian democratic circles and European democratic circles. You mentioned Second International, and Georgian Social Democrats were very good friends with German Social Democrats, French Social Democrats, and the others. So these people emerged from the Western, let's say, political milieu.
Right.
Whilst and one more point they had was feeling of responsibility, because the republic was constantly under the existential threat.
Mm-hmm.
So having power was not only a privilege, but it was responsibility. Should you lose your power, should you lose your country, the entire responsibility lies on you. While when you share this power, you share also the responsibility. But by contrast, modern Georgia probably emerged on the ruins of the Soviet Empire, which was absolutely isolated and cut off from the democratic world. And Georgians, at the end of even dissidents, at the end of 1980s and in the 1990s, had very little clue about the functioning of the democratic states, and this applies to society as well. In the rhetoric of the current political actors, state actors in Georgia, we frequently see Soviet rhetoric, so which comes from this past, and this proves the point that the Democratic Republic of Georgia is forgotten. It's not in our collective memory, and your book may contribute partly to reviving this memory. Stephen, another point I want
just a couple of things, Becca, just to underline what you're saying. I think very important part of this the ideas and to the building of the Georgian state was the predecessors to the Georgian Social Democrats, what we call the Tbilisi or the Georgian intelligentsia of the late 19th, early 20th century, that was very pragmatic, practical, participated in local government, promoted self-government as much as they could, promoted Georgian schools as much as they could. Although the Georgian Social Democrats argued with the Tbilisi, I mean, there were very significant differences. They drew a lot of their ideas, and I think this idea that you mentioned of political culture, right, in many ways comes from the activities of the Tbilisi. I mean, after all, it was Georgi Tsereteli who, we would describe as one of the Tbilisi, who gave them Kvali, a newspaper in 1898, through which they could then propagate social democratic ideas, right? So those links are very important. And the second part of this is the pro-European nature of Georgian social democracy. As you said, their connections with European socialists was extremely important. Georgians, people like Jordania, Irakli Tsereteli, and others, clearly distinguished what they saw as Georgians' Western orientation from Russia's Eastern orientation, right? This was a major theme. They saw what the Russians were doing, the Bolsheviks were doing, as anti-European and anti-democratic. And they were the opposite. They considered that national liberation for Georgia came with a pluralist democracy. This was the best way to ensure Georgian security as well. If they wanted recognition, being a dictatorship would have been harder to get recognition from Western powers than as a democracy. Having the constitution in place was extremely important to the Georgian leaders as a symbol of sort of democratic statehood. So there were all sorts of. I think this idea that they were European, they belonged to Europe, and this was why, in part, democracy was so important, and also, the fact that they could draw on very important and progressive ideas that the Tbilisi had promoted earlier.
Thank you, Stephen. One more point, and then we'll hand it over to the Q&A. And please come forward with questions. Think about it, and in 5 minutes or so, we'll be reading out loud your questions and discussing them. Stephen, citizens, you mentioned in your presentation introduction that they were trying to create citizens, and this always is this term citizens, mokalakeno. You always see on newspapers, in speeches, and despite of the fact that around 75 or 80% of the country is illiterate, and it is very difficult to make a citizen from illiterate person, they were very much determined to create citizenry. To do so, one of the major priorities for the ruling party, for Social Democrats, was education. First things what happened was opening universities, which was not allowed in previous times by the Tsarist administration, and the university was opened in 1918, and it was turned into state university. They opened in less than 3 years, they opened up to 1,300 schools. So Irakli Ramazan counted it, and we count by days. So per day, they would open 1.2 schools, which is a lot. Um, as they were sending out students in Europe, so they wanted educated society with civic understanding. And despite of the fact that the population was illiterate, they gave voting rights to everyone. So
Yeah.
equal voting rights to everyone. So why was it so important for the republic to have citizens? Because to me, it sounds like this mokalake no mokalakebi sounds like French Revolution's citoyens or co-citoyens. Like were they uh, affected by the ideas of the French Revolution, or what was that?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, when you read Nouri Jordania's speeches and Nouri Ramashvili, they're constantly speaking about the French Revolution and the legacy of the French Revolution. Nouri, but from two different points of view, by the way. Jordania was talking about the French Revolution as this great liberating movement, right, that created citoyen, right? On the other hand, Ramashvili was talking about it. Nouri Ramashvili, who was the Minister of Interior, was talking about the discipline that was required for a revolutionary government to survive, right? So it was but they both used the example of the French Revolution to justify their arguments. I think one of the complexities for Georgia in particular, of course, was the multi-ethnic nature of the republic, and they had to create some degree of allegiance among national minorities in Georgia. And one way to do that was to A, give them self-governance, but also to create this sense that the state was theirs too, right? And that they had equal rights as non-Georgians in a Georgian state. And actually, if you look at the laws on citizenship that the Georgians passed, for two laws on citizenship, or maybe the first one was a decree, I can't remember. But anyway, the law on citizenship is quite clear. You know, it is based on this idea of jus soli, right? The judicial idea that it's not your ethnicity that counts, it is your residence, right, where you were born, rather like the American conception. And so this sort of creates a flat field for everybody living in Georgia, that they are all citizens. If you didn't generate that loyalty and that commitment to statehood from non-Georgians, and the Georgian government had great difficulty doing that, but they tried very hard, and citizenship was one way to do it. Then you would face internal threats and insecurity and so on. So it was very important to the legitimacy of the state. And then, of course, and I'll just stop here. Once you have citizens, you can start asking for taxes, which was something you can't build a state without money, and you had to have that commitment too.
Thank you, Stephen. Now I'll turn it over to the audience. The question: looking back from today, what could the first Georgian Republic have done to preserve its independence? Did it realistically have any chance to survive?
That's a very good question, and it's one that you and I have discussed plenty of times. Uh,
You can
it was
discuss it publicly now.
Yeah, it's very hard. It was very hard for a small state like Georgia to survive because it was surrounded by avaricious imperial states, namely the Ottoman Empire, which became the Turkish Republic, which still had territorial claims on Georgia, and of course the Bolsheviks. So it was rather like poor little Czechoslovakia, on the eve of World War II, that was just surrounded by big powers and was unable to sustain its independence. But part of the other part of this also was the lack of commitment from the international community to keep Georgia independence, despite its strategic importance. There was no, I mean, Jordania complained right at the end of the First Republic. Um, I think he was writing to Oliver Wardrop, who was the chief commissioner in Georgia, saying, "You have not supplied us with any arms or financial support. How are we going to survive if we don't get these commitments from Western powers?" And they didn't. They got some minor help, but that was so. This brings in the whole question of the international community and its commitment to small states, and that's something that I think we're going to see repeated today. Small states now, again, are extremely vulnerable to the whole idea of great powers and spheres of influence. And this is, of course, something that would suit Russia enormously because it's exercised those sorts of tactics for centuries and is doing so today. So, the international community and its role is very important in the preservation of small states. But the other part of it finally was, Georgia just didn't have the resources. It did try to get a loan from Great Britain, as you know. It didn't come through. So Georgia was blockaded at this time. So it had this great resource of manganese that it could have exported that it was unable to do. And so what was the alternative for Georgia? It was to print money. And of course, it led to hyperinflation and economic chaos in Georgia. And that was also one of the features that weakened Georgia internally, right? Its economy. Um, but, the most outstanding feature that led to the collapse of Georgian independence was, of course, the Bolsheviks, who were committed to the idea that the Caucasus because of oil and of manganese, was extremely important to possess. And of course, they didn't really believe in self-determination, despite their advocacy for it and some of their programs. Um, they believed that Soviet power was going to liberate people whether they wanted it or not. And that's what happened.
Uh, I will just add brief remarks. Georgia's independence didn't collapse internally, like it didn't collapse
Right.
through internal weakness. It was crushed by foreign aggression. Should there not be a foreign aggression, this republic was viable by far, especially after having gained international recognition, which provided opportunity of getting foreign loans, being engaged in exports, imports, and economic
Right.
ties would be established with the Western powers, etc. And Georgia, so amongst the former Russian subjects, only 6 of them got de jure recognition. Those were Finland, Poland, 3 Baltic republics, and Georgia. So it was only Georgia which was overrun and occupied in 1921,
Right.
and all others 5 lived and up until 1939, 1940.
Right.
So this tells us that Georgia's problem was not, let's say, uh, uh, Georgia's problem alone. Georgia's problem was the region. So it was
Yeah.
in the Caucasus region, far from it was far from the Europe's security architecture, which was established after the
Right.
Treaty of Versailles.
Right.
And the Western powers were interested in building barbed wire between Germany and Russia,
Right.
and they sponsored Polish independence, Baltic independence, and the Georgia's independence was not part of this security architecture. Apart from that, in Baku, the government was not strong enough. It was easily crushed by Bolshevik coup d'etat, and then overrun by 11th Red Army without any resistance. Actually, they occupied Baku, and as main champion of Georgia's independence, Lord Curzon put it, without Azerbaijani independence, Georgia's independence cannot be
Right.
viable.
Yeah.
Because
Just let me add, and then we'll get to the next question, Becca. But I think there was also some personal involvement here, and thinking of Stalin
Stalin,
and
of course,
Orjonikidze, right, who really took the reins in terms of making decisions and pushing uh, Soviet leaders in Moscow to the idea that Georgia had to be occupied. Uh, without Stalin or Orjonikidze, would it have happened? Probably. Would it have happened so quickly? Unlikely, right? So there was this very personal element coming from Georgian Bolshevik leaders who wanted their revenge against Jordania and other leaders. I think that was also part of it.
very true, very true. So the next question, Professor Jones mentioned the chaotic environment created by the First World War in the period of Georgian and others' independence. How did the war shape the First Republic? I mean, this is a fantastic question in my opinion because it was shaping daily life of the republic, the war, and eventually it resulted into non-viable Georgian economy and yeah.
Right. So the war, obviously, in many ways, led to the creation of the Republic in the first place because it led to the collapse of the Russian Empire, the defeat of Ottoman Turkey, uh, and briefly the Germans stepped in. The German Empire was in some sense the midwife of Georgian independence. So again, going back to this issue of how the context of war and the context of international rivalry plays such a powerful role in the creation of independent states in certain periods of history. Um, the other part about the war was, of course, the war ends in 1918, and the international powers decided among themselves who would get independence, who would not, who required some sort of supervision, and this whole system of mandates was created in the League of Nations, right, to protect small states and minorities in this new world order, right, after the war. But the practical problem for some of these small states and Georgia in particular, as you said, was the regional environment. I mentioned earlier that because of the war, there were economic blockades on Georgia that lasted until 1920, which made it almost impossible for Georgia to have normal trade. And there were internal economic problems, inflation in particular, that made it very hard for Georgia to trade with a real currency. It didn't really have a currency. You know, much of the trade that went on was barter. That is extremely limiting for any state. Just to sum it up, I would say, one of the underlying major problems for Georgia was its capacity as a state because of its lack of financial means. It did tremendous work in creating a constituent assembly and creating what were known as the Erebar, the local government bodies, an independent judiciary, right? More or less. Tremendous feats within 2 years and 10 months of their existence. Um, and much of it really without money. It was, you know, but they I think at some stage hit the limits in large part because of the external situation, which made it extremely difficult for Georgia to maintain its contacts with Europe and establish relations with European economies. Um, and that was a major. The other part of it, of course, that war militarized the Georgian state. At least by 1920, end of 1920, 21, about 50% of the Georgian budget was going on military expenditures. That was money that could have gone to state building, but it had to go to armies to protect Georgia's borders and from invasion. And that was, a legacy of the war. So,
Stephen, thank you. Next question. I mean, we have two questions about the Constitution or constitutions. So first republics and current constitutions, and I'll combine those two questions. So how much the current constitution reflects the first republic politics of Georgia? And also the other question is that Chapter 16 of the First Republic Constitution declared secularism. And how was that taken by public? Because the author of the question, David Mahrazes, thinks that if this was declared today, this would be an impossible task.
right. I mean, yeah, that's a very good question, and I would love to write a thesis about it. I don't have time now, unfortunately. But the whole idea of the connection between the Constitution of the First Republic and what we see today, I mean, the in many ways, I think the Constitution we see today was influenced by the Soviet legacy, and of course by the attempt of Shevardnadze to create a presidential republic. Keep in mind that Georgia's constitution was essentially a parliamentary republic, right? Whether Jordania was a president or not was not clearly defined. But even if he was a president, maximum he was given 2 years as president or as head of state, right? It was a constitution that was supposed to reflect the power of the people, right? So, for example, social and economic rights were incorporated into the Constitution, which is rare in constitutions. Um, it was extremely advanced for its time in terms of giving the vote to women and other minorities. Um, clearly the Constitution was part of sort of a Western understanding of the role of law. And in theory, Constitution in Georgia today is part of that idea that the fundamental law in the country is embedded in the Constitution. But the question then is, how are those laws implemented? It's not just about writing a constitution, it's about how that constitution is protected, how that constitution, how the laws and the articles of the constitution are implemented, if at all. And that requires a whole different infrastructure. I think it was Jordania himself who said there's a difference between a constitution and constitutionalism. And I think that's, what we're seeing today in Georgia, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Stephen. So we are running out of time, but if that's okay, there's questions, and I'll add 5 minutes to our discussion to read out the last two questions for Stephen. So the following question comes from our friend Ega Gobia. Tell us more about the efforts to gain international recognition. And also in the beginning, it was Germany that was favoring Georgia's independence and supporting it. Then it was taken over by the British. How did the transition period affect the efforts of the Georgian government to gain recognition?
Well, the Germans stepped in 1918. Essentially, it was in their own interests to do so, because again they thought of oil and manganese and the Transcaucasian Railway, which would give them access to markets in the Middle East. So, they had their own interests, but for Georgians it was important. They needed protection from the Ottoman Empire, and Germany was the source of that protection. This is the problem for small states. You have to maneuver. They had a difficult job explaining it to their socialist comrades in Europe that they were, you know, they were accepting the protection of an imperial empire, Germany, right, to secure their independence. It wasn't a very socialist thing to do. Uh, um, but then Germany lost the war, and the British had this sort of informal mandate that they had agreed to with other Western powers that they were responsible for the Caucasus. And they stepped in. They thought also they would make gains, some economic gains from occupying this territory, but they soon became rather disillusioned with it. They didn't make they didn't get the oil that they thought they would, or the manganese they thought they would. Um, and the British themselves were facing definite internal problems, and back home, people wanted to end the war. They wanted to end this sort of commitment to imperial rule. They just wanted the boys back home, right? And the British were having tremendous problems in Ireland and India and elsewhere in their empire. So although they initially supported the idea of Georgian independence because it could act as a buffer against Russia and its aspirations to um, to have influence or even defeat British interests in India and in Iran, right? They needed something to protect that. Lord Curzon, who was the foreign secretary at this time, had this idea of a middle wall that the Caucasus, like Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, would act as a middle wall that would protect the British Empire from Russian advance. So the empires had their own interests. It wasn't a sort of benign thing that they were doing just to help Georgians, right? But Georgians also faced this issue, right? In the end, they said they were begging the British to stay because they needed that protection from the Bolsheviks and the Ottomans. So it was a very difficult situation that required pragmatism and maneuvering, trying to gain as much as possible in terms of good economic relations with Great Britain and but also self-governance at home, right? They didn't want the British to exercise their imperial ideas in Georgia, but it was a compromise.
Thank you, Stephen. Since we're running out of time, I will not add my own comments on that. So the last question, which is a very long one, and I will have to summarize it. So the question is, the author of the question tells us that the idea of socialism has been marginalized after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It has been associated to Soviet and Bolsheviks and communists. But do you anticipate that stronger social democratic parties in the future, assuming that the country overcomes the current constitutional crisis characterized by the one-party rule? I mean, can strong social democratic parties emerge in Georgia?
That's a very good question, and I no doubt you, Becca, you and I will have different opinions about that. But there is a social democratic movement that has emerged in Georgia. Mostly young professionals. Social democracy generally tries to create support among workers and farmers and so on. There are definite weakness for the current social democratic movement in Georgia. On the other hand, it seems to me that what ordinary Georgian citizens want is economic opportunity. They don't want corruption. They want greater equality, right? They want peaceful relations with their neighbors. And these are things in many ways that social democracy offers. But as you say, that connection between Georgians today who have, over the last 3 decades, been part of a rather chaotic neoliberal strategy of economic growth, where you had massive privatization, which led to massive corruption and great inequalities. I mean, that's something that has sort of become the norm for many Georgians, and the idea that you can actually create a system that controls all that and improves the lives of ordinary citizens it's something hard to grasp. And the other issue, of course, yeah, it's the connection with Soviet history and what socialism did to Georgia during the Soviet period, which is often connected with left-wing ideas, right? Social democracy can succeed. It has succeeded in Europe, but you do need a prosperous state to create social democracy because it is a welfare state in many ways, right? And that's a difficulty for Georgia as well, in terms of economic resources for that sort of structure.
Thank you, Stephen. So just a very brief comment. Even though I'm not a social democrat and I'm not leftist, I think that healthy political systems do need. I mean, there is a niche for leftist party, common sense leftist parties. But problem for Georgia is now that there is no room currently for any political party. I mean, all the political parties will be shortly banned. And should Russia win this imperial war in Ukraine and put Georgia as its own backyard, there will be no political party.
Right.
I mean, not only leftists, but also rightists, centrists, and others.
Right.
But should democracy revive in Georgia, then social democracy probably will have another problem because the current politics are driven by money.
Right.
So money means a lot, and Georgia is very small and not wealthy society. And where the money comes from, especially for social democrats.
Right. Right. No, it is. Yeah, it's an issue.
These are the major issues. But here we come to the conclusion, and I want to thank you, Stephen, very much for very interesting and insightful conversation. We are all looking forward to having your book, and then Georgians probably are looking forward to having its translation in Georgia. Thank you, everyone, for following us for almost 1.5 hours. Thank you, Salome and Georgian Association, for having us this evening. And for the future events, Salome will tell you in greater details.
Yes, thank you so much, Becca and Stephen. What a fascinating conversation, and I hope everyone on the call really enjoyed it. So as you can see, the topics that were covered today is just kind of the opening of the series, and we are going to continue to see as the seminar session, as the webinar series continues, that the topics covered in these sessions reverberate to current days of Georgia, and we can see what are the connections between what happened 100 years ago with what is happening with and in Georgia today. And so with that, I would like to invite you to the next session, which is going to be not too far away. It's before the holiday season begins. We're going to have the next session on December 14th, titled Georgian Monks and Scribes, Shaping the Christian Legacy. And this is going to be clearly then focusing on the role of church and the faith in Georgia. And the guest there is going to be Nicholas Alexidze, Professor of History and Political Thought, Dean of Social Sciences from Free University in Tbilisi, and Professor Stephen Jones will be the host of that conversation. So as you can see, each webinar will have a different guest and a different host. So I want to say thanks again to Becca for hosting this conversation, and now we're going to swap for the next session. Stephen is going to be the host for Nicholas Alexidze, and I hope you can join us there. Before that happens, if you are in the Washington, D.C. area, you can also scan this code or go to our website, www.georgianassociation.org, and join us for an in-person activity, which is going to be on December 12th. It's a Friday, 3 p.m. If you're working, maybe you can leave a couple of hours early and join us to visit the Library of Congress for a display and a briefing on the materials of the Georgian Democratic Republic, which are held at the Library of Congress here in Washington. But if you're not in Washington, maybe you're in Tbilisi right now, you can also visit different locations in Tbilisi. You can visit the National Library or the National Archives, and there are two websites here listed where you can see those materials digitally. But if you're also in Tbilisi, you may be able to visit those locations in person and explore what is there. There are multiple different places where you can find these materials, but these two are kind of significant. And then if you are in Massachusetts or if you're visiting Harvard University, the Houghton Library has a fascinating collection also, and the archive of the First Republic materials where they actually stayed for a very long time until the independence of Georgia, at which time they were transferred back into independent Georgia again. So there's a fascinating history of Georgia-US ties there as well. And, we will probably have an opportunity to explore these different aspects. But I hope that this was a interesting opening for what is to come. And we welcome your thoughts, your feedback. Feel free to reach out to us on our website through email or social media and spread the word. We are looking forward to seeing more people attending. Lastly, I will say, we mentioned in the beginning, this webinar was recorded, so it will be on our YouTube channel. And along with the recording, you will also see these resources and other resources that are related to this topic, perhaps other materials that Stephen and Becca and others have published and written about this topic. So if you have suggestions for what should be in that list of resources, feel free to reach out to us and suggest those materials as well. Our goal is to increase awareness of Georgia outside of Georgia to people who don't necessarily know about Georgian history, and give a little bit of context from history to modern day in Georgia. So with that, again, thank you all for your attendance, and thank you so much again to Stephen and Becca for an engaging and interesting conversation today. Abba, დროებით.
დროებით, დიდი მადლობა ყველას. დიდი მადლობა ბეკა.
მადლობა დროებით.